Getting foreign nationals safely out of Gaza is a key reason behind the U.S. call for a humanitarian pause in Israeli airstrikes in the ground offensive. Canada and the other G7 countries are joining together today and repeating that appeal. Let's bring in Rebecca Collard, who's in Beirut for us this morning. Rebecca, the G7 foreign ministers are meeting in Tokyo. They released a joint statement today, and they were able to agree on the language calling for humanitarian pauses. What has come out of this G7 meeting?
Yeah, I think that's the key thing, Heather. This statement, joint statement saying, calling for humanitarian pauses and also reiterating that Israel has the right to defend itself. Now, Blinken, made a bunch of other statements, which I think are important to note, similar to what he was talking about here in the region, but we have a little bit more detail. So first of all, he talked about that Palestinians should not be displaced, forcibly displaced during this conflict or after this conflict. And he also talked again about the future of Gaza, about the day after this conflict. And let's listen to what he had to say about that.
When it comes to post-conflict governance in Gaza, a few things are clear and necessary. One, Gaza cannot be continue to be run by Hamas. That simply invites a repetition of October 7th, and Gaza used as a place from which to launch terrorist attacks. It's also clear that Israel cannot occupy Gaza.
And I think, Heather, he made that comment now about Israel not being able to reoccupy Gaza, and that has been a concern because of comments made by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over the last few days that Israel would have to play a role in Gaza's security after this conflict is over. And I think that has really raised concerns that Israel could militarily reoccupy Gaza. So I think he is trying to address that there, Heather.
So call for humanitarian pauses, not an out-and-out ceasefire. What is going to be the impact of this on the conflict, Rebecca, and I guess in terms of reaction in the Arab world?
Yeah, that's a great question, Heather. I think, and much like what we talked about on Monday as Blinken wrapped up his visit here to the region and he called for these humanitarian pauses and there was all these statements, not much. What we heard from the G7 countries was that they want humanitarian pauses, but we didn't hear any call for any mechanism to pressure either party involved in this conflict into a humanitarian pause or into any sort of cessation of hostilities. And, we did have this call yesterday from Human Rights Watch, that's a large global human rights organization, calling for an arms embargo on Israel and Palestinian groups involved in this conflict. Now, I think there's this idea that because the U.S., of course, is the biggest military and political supporter of Israel, that it could somehow pressure Israel into these humanitarian pauses that are now being called for not just by the U.S., but also by these very powerful G7 countries. But we didn't hear, Heather, is any way that these countries plan to, pressure any of the parties involved in this conflict into some sort of at least temporary cessation of hostility. So I think because of that, these calls are going to ring here fairly empty, the same way a lot of Blinken's comments when he was in this region. And we talked about this was, he calls for these things, but he does not seem to be able to implement them. And I think the real question is, if Blinken can't implement them, if the UN General Assembly call for humanitarian pauses doesn't mean anything, and if the G7 countries are unable to enforce this statement in any way, then what does it mean for the region at all? And who is able to really, bring some sort of relief, some sort of a humanitarian pause, if not a ceasefire, to Gaza, Heather?
Rebecca, thank you so much. As always, Rebecca Collard live for us in Beirut.